Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Gaming the System, the podcast where three intersectional feminists examine gaming and games through a feminist lens. I'm your host for today. I'm Jem, and I'm here with my friends Alex and Matt. So, before we get started, if you want to support us, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/gaming the system for some exclusive content, or you can send us a one-off donation via PayPal to our email address, wearegamingthesystem@gmail.com. What I wanted to do was break it down into some of the classic tropes that we see in horror games. There are many of them, and if you're interested in this, then just Google it. There's a huge amount of lists available of all the different tropes, but because we're gaming the system, we're going to focus more on the gender related tropes that come up in horror. So the first one I wanted to talk about was this idea, and we touched on it a little bit at the start, about the the sexualization of women particularly, but also the sort of forbidden nature of sex within the sort of game world, and how that impacts on the sort of the heroes and the cannon fodder and the storylines, really. So I'm interested in how you think that horror games portray these themes compared to the way that they're portrayed in movies, because I think in movies we see quite a clear line between, as in my story at the start, this idea of the girls that are the hanging out with all the boys and all of that, they're more likely to be the early victims. There's a sort of moralizing that goes on in horror movies, but they're more linear than computer games often are. So I wonder how that, and if you can give any examples of where that comes up in games that you've played.
Well, one that I can think of that fits right into what you've described, because it's so cinematic in its format, is Until Dawn, which we've played together, which was very much a bunch of teenagers go to a hut in the woods and then they gradually get killed off one by one. And there were lots of kind of tropes where a lot of the girls were sexualized, especially I can't remember the character's name, but it was Hayden Petrie. She was in she played Claire in Heroes, the blonde one. I remember there was a scene where she was having a bath, and then she gets out in a little white towel and is like, "Hello," just creeping around in the dark, and that's very much fits into that trope, I would say, of being overly sexualized in that particular scenario. But yeah, that's one I can think of right at the top of my head.
It's interesting to think of how the is the way the women in horror games are sexualized the same or different than in general stuff, because there is this definite trope of a woman and a man go or sneak off to have sex somewhere, and then they both die because they've snuck off to have sex somewhere. And that happened in Snakes on a Plane. It happens in Cabin in the Woods, I think. And let's go, what's the point? Why do they choose that? Because is it just go, hey, it's an excuse for a sexy bit, and then it's always seen as a joke. I think the using of sexualizing women as a cheap joke that it just feels like another subtle, insidious part of a lot of the media that comes out as a result of the patriarchy that just goes, women who do what they want to do, that's funny. And you want them to be the goody two shoes, blonde, middle class one that always seems to be the person that is sentient.
I think that horror stories are a progression from fairy tales. I think if we go back and look at the traditional fairy tales, the original fairy tales, they were always words of caution. They were always about they were often about, don't do this thing because this bad thing will happen. So it was things about be good, be kind, stay on the path, don't talk to strangers. There was a lot of things in a lot of messages in fairy tales that were about teaching good behaviors as was understood at the time. And I think the horror stories are a progression of that. They're just, more violence, more scary. And so we're seeing that kind of played out, this idea that, you should be good, you should be virtuous, you should be not promiscuous, and you should maintain your gender roles. So we do see this idea of women being women and men being men, as far as very cliche gender roles are set. And we see that play out, and I think we see that play out in computer games, certainly traditionally. And I think that generally horror was viewed to be a sort of male, because of its level of violence. I think it was viewed to be appealing to men primarily. However, I think these days you might find, I haven't looked at it, and I don't know if there's been research done, but I'm sure there has been. I think you might find that actually more women engage in watching horror than men, because there's an element of I don't know, exploring what the world might have to offer you, really. And I did look into some research that actually said that people that have engaged in watching horror and scary things are actually, in some cases, more able to deal with disaster scenarios. So they found that people that had watched a lot of apocalyptic horror stories and things coped with the pandemic better than those who hadn't. So there was some research into that, and it was really interesting to see how it's a sort of like a soft way of dealing with quite traumatic topics. And when we talk about the issues of violence against women and girls, then obviously horror might provide an opportunity for women and girls to actually explore what would you do if you were being followed by this monster. What would you do if somebody came into your house wielding a knife, or you were alone in a cabin in the forest and your phone had fallen down a well and there was a demon? I don't know. But it's an opportunity for people to, in a safe environment, explore how they might react in those situations, just in a sort of non-threatening way.
We talked about that a bit in one of our recent episodes, in how using games can be transgression in safety, where you can practice doing unsafe things in a completely safe environment. And there is so what art does and why experiencing as many different kinds of art is positive for you is that it expands your creative vision of what is possible. And people who don't consume art are trapped in a very narrow world. And when you're trapped in that narrow world, it's easy to convince yourself that you can be in control of things. Whereas the more art you consume, you go, holy shit, I'm not in control of anything. Literally anything could happen. And then you have to make peace with that. So I think that's a subtle thing that goes on. I found myself thinking, doing the research for that episode, there's a fascinating study of people who have serious burns, and I think this young kid who was too young to have proper pain medication for it, but they gave him this VR headset, and there was this game that was basically set in an ice world where you'd do all sorts of stuff in this ice cold environment, and that had a profound impact on his level of pain. So showing ways that particularly VR technology, I think, is underused in this kind of thing. And there's this, you mention violence against women. That is something that can happen to literally any woman, any girl, any woman. And that's just the truth of the world as it is at the moment. And I don't know how best women and girls, what is the best way that they can come to terms with that, and also what they need to do personally to I want to preface all of this by saying this is all unfair stuff. It's not a woman's responsibility to do this, but
no, absolutely.
But that's the nature of it. Because you can even go, oh, I didn't know that sort of thing happened, and then it happens to you. You go, oh, I know that sort of thing happens, but it won't happen to me. Then it happens to you. I know that sort of thing happens. It might happen to me, but I haven't done any. I don't know what I'm going to do if that happens. And then to get someone to, I know this could happen. It could happen to me. This is what I can do to, if it does happen. And I'm convinced that there is a role in that interactive art, like games, can play in that. Because I really believe in another thing they talked about was immersion therapy, which is if you're terrified of something, you can immerse yourself in it until you're not scared about it anymore. And that's something that VR is perfect for, because you can go, right, I'm claustrophobic. And then you give them a scenario where you're crawling through a tunnel and the tunnel gets tighter and tighter. And they go, right, I can't manage that anymore. And then just take it off and it's fine. And there's that point between horror, scary things purely for entertainment, and scary things as a sort of a training exercise for people. There's a place in there where I think a tremendous amount of problems can be worked on. But in order to do that with something like sexual assault, I don't know who should do that work. I don't know who, if anyone, should be working on developing that. And
I think that's a really good point, actually, that you make there. And I mean, we talk a lot, don't we, on the pod about how important it is to have a variety of people, a diverse group of people working on games and in the games industry, because then they're putting across messages that are mindful and acknowledge the many different life experiences out there. And I think that is one thing, because if you take this research that I was talking about, that watching these things as a way for people to build up a sort of practice run of how they might deal with certain situations, then there is also the issue as to what lessons are they being taught. And when you're talking about this idea of, sex outside of marriage, or, people having affairs, or same-sex relationships are sort of make you an automatic victim, or this idea that which is kind of doubled down on by this idea of the final girl character, which I came up in my story at the start about, this idea that the final girl, the survivor, is the one who is virtuous and pure of heart, and could love a unicorn, all of these things. That those are the sorts of things that those two tropes can really lay on very thickly this idea that women's value is about how submissive they are, and how virtuous they are, and their sexuality, all of which is considerably problematic. And as you've been talking about, Matt, in this episode and in previous episodes, the importance of games on our psyche and our understanding of the world around us is kind of increased beyond movies, because it's not passive. When we sit and watch a movie, we're just watching it. But when we're playing a game, we are involved in it, we are engaged in it, and that, to me, means that it's going to have a deeper impact. So yes, absolutely, it matters who is in charge of those messages and what those messages are telling us.
Yeah, because I think that if you say there's no, like, trying to think of maybe I had a VR program, not to call it a game, to simulate a sexual assault that is made by women, for women, for the sole purpose of helping imagine that scenario in a way that would help them with their mindset going forwards. Then that being abused and it's just complicated.
It is.
And I see potential there, but
I think it's because everyone's experience is going to be unique, depending on their own circumstances and their own lived experience, because we're all so individual, and there's so many layers to the ways in which we can be discriminated against and attacked in if you think about it in those ways, and abused because of our own protected characteristics or things like that. Just bringing it into like a sort of human level, I guess. I was thinking when you were talking also about how horror, we've talked about like the bodily horror and how the changing of the body is a horrific thing and a scary thing to have to think about. but there's massive overlap there with disability, but also the mental side of things. It's absolutely, a really obvious parallel with mental health and horror. The two kind of go. There's a lot of tropes around mental health and horror, and the scary person being crazy, or insane or mad. I think one of the games that we've talked about previously on the pod, I can't remember the original, but the sequel I think is called Senua's Sacrifice, and those games deal a lot with mental health and psychosis in particular. And I think that's one of the first games I remember seeing that dealt with that particular topic. And I think, as far as I understand it, it was pretty delicately done. Like they had consulted with people who had lived experience of those conditions. As far as I understand it, anyway. But that kind of taps into that games as a tool almost for those sort of practice runs in dealing with those conditions or dangerous situations or just things where, as part of the human experience, we're all going to have things go wrong with ourselves at some point or other, and that can be really scary to deal with. And I think there's definitely overlap there when we think about how horror makes us feel.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when it's done best in games, and this is where VR stuff again can be really useful, is because VR actually puts it's you experiencing something that's happening to someone else, and that like ratchets up to 11 what games can do. My mum and my sister have been playing The Last of Us Part 2, and that was the best horror game I've ever played. And not just because it's about zombies, but it's the people in it and the horrifying things that they do. And you spend the first half of the game as one person doing one thing, and then you spend the second half of the game as as another person going the exact same way and going, oh, but I identify with both of you. I don't know what the right answer is. Yeah, and Senua's Sacrifice, the first one, gets an absolute banger. Does it? Portrays psychosis in an extremely empathetic way that puts you in Senua's shoes, and you just makes you tune in to another person's experience that you can't get on your own. The sequel, however, is a wanky, self-indulgent walking simulator that if it had been made 10 years ago without the Unreal Engine, they would have been forced to make it better, because they just gone, look what this beautiful recreation of Iceland we've made, and we're going to make you walk through it slowly. And if you want to jog through it, you have to hold down. You have to hold down the L1 button the entire time. And you're just going. So I don't know what happened to the in between time, and it went away from it. It stopped. The psychosis is the core of the first game, and on the second one, it feels like how it would be used. It's a throwaway thing. I just go, oh yeah, we'll just add that on top of it rather than make it the core of it. And I think that's just because they were so enamored with how good it looked. And it's again, it comes down to the cheapening of real world scary things is a negative trope.
I think that the way that mental health and mental illness is demonstrated in games, and the 9 times out of 10 insulting ableist bollocks that comes out when either portraying or leaning heavily on disability comes into games is is sort of almost worthy of an entire episode in
sure.
itself. It's a massive topic, and it's extremely problematic. And I hope that we can continue to explore this. We're kind of coming to the end of our time, and I just need to share with you that of the 6 sections that we were going to talk about today, we've managed to cover one of them, although we have touched on many of the others. So it just goes to show that this is a massive area, and I think, many games draw on the horror genre. Even if they're not horror games, they draw on it. I do think it's worth mentioning some research that I found, which looked into they were sort of movies from the 1980s and the 1990s, but they found that women in horror movies from that era died slower than men, that they suffered more prolonged violence.
Dear.
And they said that in all the movies that they looked at, they found I think they said it was something like 5 hours of footage of women dying versus 50 minutes of men dying.
Wow.
So, if somebody's going to be decapitated in a quick, hilarious scene, that will be the man. In a long, involved torture scene will be the woman. And I think that is something that we all need to think about, really, about how that impacts our view of women and girls, and how that impacts on our expectations of what female characters can do in a computer game. And if all of your experience is these women being tortured or killed off quickly, or just making it to the end because they don't do anything bad to anyone, then when you have the opportunity to play a female character in a game, you're probably going to go no, because it just adds to this idea of sort of weakness. And I think it is really problematic.
You just reminded me of when you said when we were talking about language and swear words, how much of swearing and cursing is based around a woman's body, and it's making me think of how boys and men are conditioned to hate women. It's building that animosity and frustration and anger that when you have poorly written female characters, that just, it's another voice in that argument, and of going, oh, for God's sake, oh, for God's sake, oh, for God's sake. Oh, now I've got to play as a woman, for God's sake. And yeah, that's another massive problem, of because I've been raised and continue to exist in that world of those voices, and I recognise them now, and they're everywhere. And it's actually really, really hard to keep on top of that, of going, oh, I reacted to that way because I've been taught to react that way. And I have to go, oh, well, then my reaction is not authentically me. And then that means you have to go, oh, my reaction was not the reaction I want. And then that can be read as going, oh, I was wrong. I reacted a certain way, but I was wrong. My reactions were wrong, so I have to step back and change something. But it's much easier to go, no, it was their fault. I reacted that way because it's her fault. And that really,
and that kind of mindfulness is a lifetime project, and we all need to be sort of engaging in that on a regular basis. So I think that it's fair to say we will be coming back to this topic going forward, and very soon, I hope. So thank you both so much for being so entertaining and insightful with your comments. And Alex, I think you should write down your scary
should
story
I?
and
Yeah.
enter it into a competition. And everyone, you heard it here first, and we know it's Alex's because copyright. So yeah, no, I think that's really good, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you think about all the other issues around horror and gaming, and hopefully next time we will finish with some positive examples of horror games for you, but we'll save that for you for our next episode. So thank you both very much. Thank you everyone for watching and listening, and we will see you again very soon.
Bye.
Bye.